Full frame is overrated. And I feel like no one else is talking about that, so I feel like I need to. So let's get into the full frame versus crop sensor debate. Let's start out with the perception. There are three things I feel like are perceived when we talk about full frame cameras versus crop sensor cameras. The first is that full frame cameras are produce a better image quality than crop sensor cameras. The second is full frame cameras are better in low light conditions than crop sensor cameras. And the third is that full frame cameras produce a greater shallow depth of field than the crop sensor cameras do. Let's start out with image quality. So when it comes to image quality, a lot of times I feel like I see a narrative that if a camera is full frame, it means it automatically produces better image quality than a crop sensor camera. And that's just not true. When we look at Hollywood films, production films that are made every year, there are several Super 35 crop sensor cameras that are used. For instance, the Ari Alexa 35 is a crop sensor cinema camera, a camera costing well over $6,000, is a camera that is used regularly to produce real films that you go and watch and you see in the theaters with your friends and your family. When we look at the Red Komodo, that is a crop sensor cinema camera that is used to produce real films. Even when we look at the camera I'm shooting on right now, the Blackmagic 6K G2, that is a crop sensor camera. So just because a camera has a crop sensor doesn't automatically mean it produces less image quality, less great image quality than a full frame camera. And I know from personal experience of a wedding videographer that I've worked with several times who shoots on a Panasonic GH5. And this guy has the most incredible wedding films. He's bringing in at least $4,000 for every wedding that he does. And he's been consistently booked for the last 10 years. And he was using the GH5 for at least the last like five up until the GH6 came out and he upgraded to that. But just because a camera has a crop sensor doesn't mean that it'll produce a worse image quality than a full frame camera. Because a lot of the same elements that are applicable in a full frame camera are applicable in a crop sensor camera. Next, let's go on to low light performance. So, yes, there is some truth to the fact that a full frame camera will typically do better and produce less noise than a crop sensor camera. But although this is typical, this isn't always the case. For instance, for me, my first camera was the Canon EOS R that came out in 2018. I got it in 2022. My next camera was the Canon EOS R7, but the EOS R7 is a crop sensor camera that does better in low light conditions, producing less noise than the full frame EOS R. And if you're someone who's worried about low light performance, I wouldn't necessarily look for a camera being, full frame versus crop sensor. I would look for a camera that has a dual base ISO. For instance, the Blackmagic 6K G2 that I'm filming on right now has a dual base ISO at 400 and 3200. Because I can swap between those ISOs to get a really clean image, I can shoot at higher ISOs than I would on even a full frame camera that doesn't have a dual base ISO. So if you are looking for a camera that does well in low light, get a full frame or get a crop sensor. But I would prioritize, does this have a dual base ISO and what is it, if I'm looking for a camera that does well in low light conditions. Also, aren't we investing in lights? I feel like we're forgetting about lights. Unless you're shooting in pitch black, you typically don't need to shoot at the highest ISO. And while I think 12,800 is great for a is great with the Sonys, that's really dope. Um that's really fantastic. I also think, a lot of us are bringing lights wherever we're going. Lastly, let's talk about depth of field. Yes, it is true that when it comes to a full frame camera, you typically are able to get a more shallow depth of field than you are on a crop sensor camera. But it's not a difference that is enormous. It's a small marginal difference. You would think that the way some of the YouTubers and influencers and content creators talk about this variation, that it's something enormous, that if you film at a f1.8 on a crop sensor camera, that it'll look like a f16 on a full frame camera. It is not that enormous of a difference because, as we all know, the greatest indicator of whether you have a shallow or deep depth of field is always going to be your aperture. If I need a shallower depth of field, then I'll get a faster lens. I'll get something that shoots at f1.8. I'll get something that shoots at f1.4, 1.2 even. But that's all you have to do if you want a shallower depth of field. You don't have to automatically convert to a whole different camera just because you might get a small marginal difference when it comes to creating a shallow depth of field. This video is not meant to dissuade anybody from buying a full frame camera. I started with a full frame camera. That was my first one. But I really just want to kind of dispel a lot of the myths and the rumors when it comes to full frame versus crop sensor. A lot of these differences are very small, and a lot of them don't really apply to a lot of real world situations. So, next time you hear that a new camera's coming out and they say, oh man, this is another APS-C camera, your first thought shouldn't be, oh God, no, I can't get that because it's APS-C. You know, it's valuable to take a look at that camera, to consider that camera, because it could be just as valuable to you as a full frame camera. Some situations it could even be more valuable because a APS-C camera can use full frame and crop sensor lenses. Typically, full frame cameras can only use full frame lenses unless they have like a super 35 mode in the camera that can crop in. But that's neither here nor there. Don't believe the lies when it comes to full frame versus APS-C. Thanks for watching.